Mrs. Connolly had built her reputation as a no-nonsense math teacher over 2 decades at Woodvale High. She believed that order and discipline were the cornerstones of a proper education, and she upheld this belief in every class she taught. But her notion of discipline sometimes veiled something darker, a set of biases she could hardly recognize in herself. This term, her attention turned sharply to a new student, Amara Edwards. Amara joined Mrs. Connolly's class in mid-September, midway through the school's first quarter. She was immediately noticeable, not only because she was one of the few black students in the predominantly white school, but also for her quiet confidence. Amara didn't shrink in her seat or try to disappear into the background, and that confidence irritated Mrs. Connolly, though she couldn't quite admit why. On her first day in Mrs. Connolly's math class, Amara quickly raised her hand to answer a question, her voice clear and precise as she gave the correct response. The answer was right, but Mrs. Connolly's tone was cold.
"A lucky guess, it seems,"
she muttered, her gaze moving dismissively over Amara as she turned to another student to continue the discussion. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Connolly's treatment of Amara grew more pronounced. She made a point to call on Amara for the hardest questions, often questions beyond the curriculum level, just to put her on the spot. When Amara succeeded, Mrs. Connolly would find some way to downplay her success. When she stumbled, Mrs. Connolly's voice would fill the classroom with subtle reprimands about
lack of preparation
and
needing to keep up.
The other students were aware of it too. There was a thick unease in the classroom whenever Amara was singled out. One day, after another particularly harsh critique of Amara's work, Mrs. Connolly decided to send her to the principal's office. The reason was vague, something about a lack of respect and a disruptive attitude. Amara, keeping her head high, gathered her books and left without a word, her jaw set tight. When Amara arrived at Principal Linda Edwards' office, her mother was startled to see her daughter standing there, visibly shaken, but trying to hold herself together.
"Amara, what happened?"
Dr. Edwards asked, concern softening her usually stern demeanor. Amara hesitated. She didn't want to burden her mother with what she was experiencing. She knew how hard her mother had worked to earn her position, to be respected, and she didn't want to cause trouble.
"It's nothing, Mom. I mean, Principal Edwards. Mrs. Connolly just thinks I need to work on my attitude."
Dr. Edwards frowned. This wasn't the first time she had heard the name Mrs. Connolly in a negative context. Over the past few weeks, she'd heard whispers among students and even some concerned parents about Mrs. Connolly's approach with certain kids, particularly Amara. She decided it was time to look into it herself, but quietly. She couldn't afford to rush into this without knowing all the facts. The next week, Principal Edwards made several unannounced visits to Mrs. Waster Connolly's classroom. She watched as Mrs. Connolly interacted with her students, her eyes narrowing at how her daughter seemed to be treated with an unusual level of scrutiny. During one such visit, she noticed Amara working through a complex problem at the board. The problem was far beyond what the rest of the class had been assigned. As Amara struggled, Mrs. Connolly made a comment, almost under her breath.
"I guess some people just aren't cut out for higher-level math."
Dr. Edwards clenched her jaw. It was becoming clear that what Amara was facing wasn't just tough teaching. It was targeted, deliberate, and deeply inappropriate. Wanting to gather more evidence before acting, Dr. Edwards approached Mrs. Connolly a few days later, under the guise of discussing student progress. She asked about several students, including Amara, careful to keep her tone neutral.
"How is Amara Edwards doing in your class?"
"Amara, she's struggling to say the least. I've tried to help, but sometimes students like her need more basic guidance. She has trouble understanding more advanced concepts and, well, there are some issues with her attitude."
Dr. Edwards raised an eyebrow.
"Students like her?"
She echoed, her voice steady but her eyes sharp. Mrs. Connolly hesitated, her expression flinching slightly before she recovered.
"You know, students who aren't used to our standards."
She replied vaguely.
"It's a matter of discipline and focus."
The principal nodded, her face giving nothing away.
"I see. Well, I appreciate your effort, Mrs. Connolly,"
she said before excusing herself. Inside, her emotions churned, a mix of anger, sadness, and protectiveness. Dr. Edwards knew it was time to address the situation directly. That evening, she spoke with Amara, gently encouraging her to share everything that had been happening. Amara hesitated, but the tears she had been holding back began to flow. She spoke about the belittling comments, the impossible questions, the sense of being targeted. It broke Dr. Edwards' heart, but it also steeled her resolve. The following week, Dr. Edwards called a meeting with Mrs. Connolly. It was after school hours, and the office was empty save for the two women. Mrs. Connolly entered confidently, though the unexpected nature of the meeting seemed to unnerve her slightly.
Please have a seat.
Dr. Edwards gestured to the chair across from her desk. Mrs. Connolly sat, her smile tight.
I've been doing some classroom observations.
Dr. Edwards began, her tone measured.
I've also spoken with students and reviewed some reports. There's a pattern of behavior in your classroom that deeply concerns me, particularly in relation to Amara Edwards.
Mrs. Connolly's expression stiffened.
With all due respect, Principal Edwards, I treat all my students equally. If Amara is struggling, it's only because I'm pushing her to do better.
Dr. Edwards' eyes narrowed, her calm composure barely masking her underlying fury.
Amara is not struggling because of her abilities, Mrs. Connolly. She's struggling because you have targeted her. You have humiliated her in front of her peers, and you have treated her differently because of who she is.
Mrs. Connolly opened her mouth to protest, but Dr. Edwards cut her off, her voice rising, no longer holding back.
And what you seem to have failed to realize, Mrs. Connolly, is that Amara is my daughter.
The color drained from Mrs. Connolly's face. She stared at Dr. Edwards, speechless, as the reality of her actions sank in. The principal's voice softened, though it trembled with the weight of her emotions.
Amara didn't tell me what was happening because she didn't want to cause trouble. She wanted to earn her place here, just like anyone else. But she shouldn't have to fight against prejudice in her own classroom.
Mrs. Connolly sat in stunned silence, her usually confident demeanor shattered. She struggled for words, but none came. The gravity of what she had done, not only as a teacher, but as a person entrusted with the care of young minds, hit her with full force.
I will be recommending to the school board that you be placed on leave while we conduct a formal review.
Dr. Edwards continued.
Your actions are unacceptable, and there will be consequences. Every student deserves to be treated with respect and fairness, regardless of their background.
Mrs. Connolly left the office that day, her steps heavy, her mind swirling with regret and fear. She had thought herself a strict but fair teacher, but now she was forced to confront an uglier truth about herself. Amara, meanwhile, began to thrive once more. With Mrs. Connolly placed on leave, a substitute took over the math class, someone who valued each student's potential. Amara's confidence returned, her love for learning reignited. She knew her mother had stood up for her, but more importantly, she had stood up for herself by not letting Mrs. Connolly's words define her worth. Dr. Edwards watched her daughter with pride, knowing that while the battle against prejudice was far from over, they had taken an important step forward, together. And Mrs. Connolly, sitting alone in her empty home, was left to confront the biases she had harbored for so long, realizing that change had to start with her if she ever hoped to teach again.